I'd say good morning, good afternoon, and good everyone, wherever it is that you are joining us from around the world. Whether it is in the Americas, good morning, midday in Africa and Europe, and, good evening here in Asia. I want to extend a very warm welcome to you. My name is Josephine Ngala. I'm an evaluation assistant consultant at the Independent Evaluation Unit and here at the Green Climate Fund, and I'll be your moderator for today. Um, yes, thank you for making the time to be with us. We have an exciting session ahead, and I'm looking forward to engaging with all of you as we dive into the third GLocal session of the week organized by the IEU. This particular one is titled From Safeguards to Agency, Evaluating the Green Climate Fund's approach to Indigenous Peoples, also known as the IPs. Now, this session is grounded in a recent evaluation conducted by the IEU, which examined the relevance, coherence, and effectiveness of the Green Climate Fund's approach to Indigenous peoples. We have two presenters, that is Rishabh Moudgill, who is IEU's policy and evaluation specialist, and we have Genta Konci, who's an evaluation specialist at the unit as well. They led the evaluation on GCF's approach to IPs, and thus will take us through the key findings and recommendations. Following the presentations by our two evaluators, we'll be joined by Helen Magata, a member of the Indigenous Peoples Advisory Group of the GCF, that's the IPAG, and she will definitely help us to enrich the dialogue as a discussant. For those who are less familiar with IPAG, it is a group that was established by under the GCF's Indigenous Peoples policy to enhance the coordination between the GCF and its accredited and executing entities, governments, and obviously the Indigenous peoples directly. Today's discussion will surely help us, kind of reflect on how the fund itself and the broader climate finance architecture can move from the protective safeguards towards enabling the true agency, inclusion, and partnership with Indigenous communities. As we move through the presentations, we encourage you to share your questions and reflections in the chat at any given time. We will be collecting them through the session and we'll dedicate some time at the end for a Q&A discussion where we'll bring your voices into the conversation. Of course, if you prefer, you're also welcome to hold your questions until the end and raise them during the Q&A segment. Rishabh, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Josephine. Good evening to all from the headquarters of the Green Climate Fund in Songdo, South Korea. My name is Rishabh, and I'm pleased to present the independent evaluation on assessing the relevance and effectiveness of the GCF's approach to and consideration of the Indigenous peoples, the IPs. This evaluation is situated within a broader climate finance context in which IPs are recognized as essential custodians of ecosystems and climate resilience, yet remain largely excluded from direct access to international resources, and in this case, to international climate finance. This evaluation examined access to GCF finance, as well as project-level implementation, with particular attention to participation and outcomes for IPs communities. I must state that the board of the GCF considered this evaluation at its 41st board meeting in February this year, and I'm pleased to state that all recommendations made in this evaluation were adopted by the GCF board. In 2018, the GCF adopted its Indigenous Peoples Policy, the IPs policy, articulating commitments to Indigenous rights, traditional knowledge systems, and free, prior, and informed consent, FP, amongst others. And in this evaluation, we also undertook the review of the implementation of GCF's IPs policy. So let's get the boring bits out of the way first. Methodology. We used mixed method approaches, including portfolio analysis, extensive literature review, semi-structured key informant interviews and focus group discussions. We undertook 5 country case studies, and we also undertook vast consultations with Indigenous stakeholders. To collect data for this evaluation, we undertook 5 country case study visits to Botswana, Colombia, Paraguay, the Philippines, and Vanuatu. For this presentation, I have clubbed the findings into 4 key areas. Let's start with the first one. To begin with, the GCF's approach towards IPs is defined primarily by the IPs policy and supported by the ESS safeguards. We found that the GCF's IPs policy is widely regarded for many of its strengths. Next slide, please. But we also found that the policy to be generally consistent with the UNFCCC's guidance given to the fund. However, from a normative perspective, and to align more with recent advancements made in the international narrative, we found that additional foundational and operational details are warranted in the policy. Thirdly, we concluded that the GCF's safeguarding policies are broadly aligned in intent towards the IPs, but inconsistent terms and concepts can undermine how the IPs are considered. The IPs policy is currently not fully integrated into the GCF's safeguarding policy suite, which may lead to inconsistent application during appraisal of projects. Moving on to the role of the Indigenous Peoples Advisory Group, the IPAG, which was established to advise and enhance dialogue among IPs-related stakeholders within the GCF's ecosystem. We find that the IPAG, which was created in accordance with the IPs policy, is still establishing its institutional linkages and resources. However, its creation holds promise for implementing the IPs policy effectively. Let me now turn to GCF projects with IPs, focusing first on origination and access, which is often an area of interest. The report finds, sorry, I think we're on the wrong side. Number 2 on GCF projects with IPs. Super. Yes, thanks. Let's now turn to GCF projects with IPs, focusing first on origination and access, which is often an area of interest. The report finds that the fund's overall approach towards IPs focuses on 2 key areas: preventing harm through safeguards and promoting information sharing, participation, and consultation. While commendable, this approach lacks a clearly defined commitment to providing IPs with specific access to resources and benefits. Also, GCF projects are expected to focus on national level or country priorities. Its government-centric and accreditation-based model presents a systemic challenge to IPs accessing climate finance, including funding directly from the GCF. And external evidence suggests that supporting IPs can cost effectively and sustainably achieve mitigation and adaptation results. Yet the GCF is the only major multilateral climate fund without a specific mechanism or commitment to support IPs. Next slide, please. Interestingly, which also created a challenge for this evaluation as well, we found that the precise number of IPs beneficiaries cannot be determined, nor can the finance directed towards them be estimated with precision. Currently, GCF has a portfolio of 297 approved projects with committed finance of approx $16.7 billion in 133 developing countries. Out of this, our evaluation team estimates 128 GCF projects, which includes activities relevant to IPs as of the end of 2024. Importantly, the GCF's approach to IPs is perceived primarily as a compliance exercise, rather than an opportunity to harness the contribution of IPs in implementing climate actions and achieving meaningful results. We found that the policy's compliance-driven approach can create disincentives for GCF's partners when developing meaningful projects involving IPs. This could potentially lead to the exclusion of IPs from GCF projects. The fund also has many access modalities like the SAP, alongside technical assistance modalities like the Project Preparation Facility, the PPF. And these modalities currently do not sufficiently integrate IP considerations or specifically support IP's relevant projects. And while the GCF's readiness modality, the RPSP, can be crucial and effective in integrating IP's considerations into programming, We find that the use of RPSP has currently been opportunistic. Next slide, please. All right. When we looked into the implementation, the downstream side of the GCF's 128 IPs relevant projects, we found that the IPs policy and other strategy and policy decisions by the board encourage integrating traditional knowledge into GCF financed activities where suitable. However, we find that applying this knowledge depends on time and resources available to GCF partners. When utilized, however, this knowledge enhances project relevance and sustainability. Moving on to monitoring and evaluation. As the GCF lacks portfolio level commitments focusing on IPs, its monitoring and results measurement systems do not track specific IPs related indicators, making it challenging to assess the fund-wide results regarding the IPs. And while a portfolio level assessment of results is not feasible, some emerging outcomes are visible in individual projects for sure. The evaluation finds that the IP's project level outcomes correlate with national contexts and power dynamics among actors. The outcomes can be affected by the level of meaningful participation of IPs in project design making processes and benefit sharing mechanisms. We also looked into the co-benefits. The GCF's monitoring framework does not mandate tracking or reporting of co-benefits specifically related to IPs, resulting in the GCF missing the opportunity to assess and understand the broader impacts of its funded projects on IPs. The scope of co-benefits remain limited during the design, approval, and monitoring phases. When we looked into the gender considerations, the evaluation positively found a general alignment of GCF policies on gender. But we also found that the Indigenous women are not systematically targeted by IP's relevant projects. The participation of Indigenous women is limited to capacity building efforts only, not amounting to proactive empowerment. So please. Right, I'm going to rush to finish this presentation because we have other speakers coming in. So this is my final slide on the final areas of findings. Here we looked into the factors affecting the GCF's approach to IPs. And before I begin, I should state that some of these issues highlighted here are not unique to the GCF alone. Some of these challenges are generally faced while programming with IPs generally. Here we find that the policy's application is broad in scope. Its implementation is rooted in and subject to the national context, where the GCF does not play a proactive role. Consequently, the policy's implementation is highly variable and falls outside the GCF's direct sphere of influence. Moving on, due to inconsistencies in the documentation regarding the oversight of policy's implementation after project approval, it is not possible to draw a more significant conclusion on the effectiveness of the IP's policy. Monitoring of compliance requirements has limitations, which can expose the fund and IPs to risks. Lastly, and crucially, when we talk about free, prior, and informed consent, FPIC, the evaluation found that the policy frames the use of FPIC as a generally well-intentioned iterative process. We see that as a big positive. However, in practice, we find that FPIC is limited by the scope of its application, timing in project origination, where one can view FPIC as a one-off event rather than a continuous process, and on the lack of availability of resources to support good faith negotiations expected by the GCF, at least in the policy. The evaluation also finds mixed evidence on using FPIC to empower the IPs, for them to actively shape or reject GCF projects. However, in cases where IPs are indeed able to shape the consent process meaningfully, it leads to sustainable project outcomes. With this, I conclude the presentation on findings here. We will now present the recommendations made in this evaluation, which were adopted by the board, by the way. So over to you, Genta. Take it away.
Thank you, Rishabh. And dear participants, it's indeed a pleasure to present the recommendations of this evaluation. As we've been reiterating, these recommendations were fully agreed by the Secretariat and adopted by the GCF board. So I'll start going through our 5 recommendations, which the first 2 are more looking to the short and medium term. And then the last three, looking into more strategic and visionary changes and modifications that the GCF needs to undergo to effectively implement the Indigenous Peoples policy. So recommendation one consists that or defines that GCF should continue reinforcing the IP's policy and operational guidelines and calibrating its operational tools to fully implement the intended objectives of the IP's policy. And to do so, it is essential for GCF to promote awareness among the NDAs, the accredited entities, by leveraging on the IPAG legitimacy and expertise. Also, under the current operational guidelines of the IP's policy, to further update, improve, and operationalize the inclusion of traditional knowledge. And of course, it is important for GCF to reflect the normative priorities emerging at the global level in future policy updates. And some areas, for example, could include locally led adaptation, enhanced participatory governance, and as I said earlier, also integration of traditional knowledge. In the medium term, recommendation 2 advises GCF to establish mechanisms and provide resources, including technical and financial support for the effective implementation of the policy. And for this, it is essential that an enabling environment for IPs need to be created and curated by recognizing their needs, further integration in the GCF operational and strategic documents, advance the IP's narrative in contexts where the full intent of the IP's policy cannot be implemented due to preceding national legislation, and actively support development of IP's projects. Also, modalities such as PPF and RPSP to better target and address IP's needs. And improve, also important here under this recommendation, is to improve monitoring in projects that involve IPs. And this would entail specific IPs indicators, measuring of co-benefits, and gender disaggregated data. And moving to recommendation 3, this looks more into the business model and a set of strategic decisions and changes that GCF needs to undertake long term. Within the second level due diligence role and compliance-based architecture, the GCF needs to address the limitations in compliance oversight, ensuring sufficient flexibility to adapt the IP's policy to a diversity of contexts and risks. And for this, the evaluation recommends for GCF to reinforce oversight by enhancing IP's relevant information in reporting, monitoring, and evaluation, build capacities to monitor compliance, strengthen the IPAG's role in project review and monitoring, enhance compliance mechanism and monitoring tools, and build and enhance grievance mechanisms at all levels. Recommendation 4 suggests that GCF must address the fundamental challenges of the business models for Indigenous peoples and consider an IP-specific window or program. Such a window should include the following: a strategic portfolio commitment by dedicating a portion of GCF resources to IPs, customize the current business model, among other things, by leveraging on the intermediary role of Indigenous peoples organizations, develop an IP-oriented culture within the organization that recognizes IPs as rightful stewards and custodians of resources and territories, and of course, move towards a paradigm shift for IPs with a more strategic and systemic, deliberate means for benefiting IPs from GCF projects. And finally, the recommendation 5, GCF must further clarify its strategic position on IPs as it undergoes its restructuring and undertakes strategic decisions, and provide clear direction on its approach to Indigenous peoples. In implementing this recommendation, it is important and imperative that in implementing the IP's policy, the GCF should balance flexibility and prescription and clearly define this in guidelines and operational tools. Approach to IPs should be clarified, including if the GCF will or will not more actively support IPs and strengthen their institution. The GCF should use its position to set standards for good faith negotiations, engagement, and empowerment of IPs. And finally, the GCF should explore its role and potential for creating an enabling environment for IPs and meaningfully engage with them. And this concludes my section on the recommendation. Over to you, Josephine.
Thank you very much. And wow. Thank you to both our presenters, really, Rishabh and Genta, for the very thoughtful, very detailed insights on the evaluation. For now, I would like to move over to the panel discussion segment of this session. We want to have the opportunity to reflect a little more deeply on the evaluation's findings and the recommendations that Genta and Rishabh have gone through, and basically explore what these insights mean for the future of Indigenous peoples' engagements, particularly in climate finance. Joining us for this conversation is Helen Magata, a member of the Indigenous Peoples Advisory Group. That is what we call IPAG. To start off the conversation, Helen, could you briefly share a little bit about, your role on the, in IPAG and your broader work in, climate advocacy, just to help to stage, set the stage for those who may not necessarily be familiar. And based on your background, perhaps touch upon which aspects of the IU's evaluation findings would most resonate with your experience. Are there like particular insights that reflect the realities you've seen on the ground, or perhaps areas where, the findings could go even further? We would love to hear your perspective. Please go ahead, Helen.
Thank you very much, Josephine. And it's good evening from my side of the world. I'm from the Philippines. And thank you very much, Rishabh and Genta, for the very comprehensive presentation of the IEU, the results of the IEU evaluation. And so I am a member of the Indigenous Peoples Advisory Group of the Green Climate Fund. It was set up as a result of the Indigenous Peoples policy that was adopted by the board in 2018. So the Indigenous Peoples policy provides that the GCF should constitute its Indigenous Peoples Advisory Group to provide advice to the Secretariat, to accredited entities, to the national designated authorities, and to the board as may be requested, and also to oversee the implementation of the Indigenous Peoples policy. So that's the short description of what the Indigenous Peoples Advisory Group is. Currently, there are 6 members of the Indigenous Peoples Advisory Group from the regions where the GCF is working, and I'm one of them. Now back to the IEU evaluation findings and recommendations. I must say that the Indigenous Peoples Advisory Group agree to most of the IEU findings and recommendations. But a lot of them resonate with the experience of Indigenous peoples in the communities that we come from or we represent, but I'm going to highlight some of them. First is that it's of course concerning to see and to hear that the GCF is the only major multilateral climate fund without a specific mechanism or commitment to support Indigenous peoples. This is something big. And if we talk about reputation, this is this should be a risk, reputation risk for the GCF if it doesn't do anything about this. And it follows that we are also very supportive of the recommendation of the evaluation to operationalize an Indigenous people specific window to ensure Indigenous peoples that Indigenous peoples appropriately benefit from GCF activities. I think we have a very robust Indigenous peoples policy. It's very strong. It has a lot of the elements that we have been raising in the Green Climate Fund, for instance, participation, meaningful engagement, leadership, grievance mechanism of Indigenous peoples. But there's one big aspect that we really want to also raise to the GCF, and that's the actual access to the resources of the GCF. This is very important because it's very essential to overcome systemic barriers that Indigenous peoples face in accessing resources. So having a specific window dedicated, intentional for Indigenous peoples is crucial. So a dedicated window should empower Indigenous peoples to implement their existing climate solutions based on their knowledge, governance systems, and self-determined priorities. The other one is that the IPAG has been doing some exercises with the Secretariat, particularly with the Office of the Sustainability and Inclusion, to look at the portfolio of the GCF. Because right now, the GCF doesn't have a framework to really track how much of its resources are being accessed by Indigenous peoples, how many Indigenous peoples are benefiting from GCF resources. So we also support the recommendation for developing targets, indicators, and monitoring systems, including disaggregated data, because the GCF, the IEU evaluation was also very clear about lack of data on Indigenous women and their contributions or their access to GCF resources. So looking and exploring on the use of these measures may include also allocating resources to free prior informed consent. How should it look like? How should Indigenous women be more engaged? And how do we monitor and track all of this? Because as of yet, there's nothing. You look at the funding proposal template, concept note templates, nothing on Indigenous peoples. And the other one, I think that's the GCF should also be looking more into, one, because there's a COP guidance on this, is on utilizing Indigenous people's knowledge, traditional knowledge in project development, implementation, and also in climate solutions that the GCF is financing. Yeah, and then maybe the last point for me is that building of capacities. When we talk about capacity building, I think we only look at Indigenous peoples as the recipients of building capacity building initiatives, but we should also be talking about how should we build capacities of accredited entities, NDAs, and even the GCF Secretariat to understand the distinct contributions and distinct needs of Indigenous peoples. How do we, for instance, even the Indigenous peoples policy, is this something that accredited entities really understand and appreciate in terms of how to operate? It's clear in the evaluation that there's still a lot of work that needs to be done in terms of communicating properly and also building capacities to understand Indigenous peoples and the approach of the GCF to Indigenous peoples, for that matter. Thank you, and back to you.
Thank you, Helen. Genta or Rishabh, do you have any immediate reactions to what Helen has said?
Yes, I think, no, thank you, Helen. This is great. And of course, this is also an opportunity for us to thank IPAG for the excellent collaboration we have had throughout this evaluation, and also to see that these recommendations continue to resonate with the IPAG vision and support to GCF. So I think, yeah, we have been collaborating closely with IPAG during this evaluation, starting from the initial stages in the development of the TORs and then the consultations throughout the evaluation. Maybe on the traditional knowledge, I think all your points are spot on. I think of course the resource part and the window is something that we also see the Secretariat being very focused on. We have been following the conversations happening within the Secretariat after this evaluation, was adopted by the board. So it seems there is an interest and focus of the current designated staff to implement these recommendations as effectively as possible, and especially the one related to the window. So I think there is some work going on in that sense. In terms of traditional knowledge, I think that's something that we're also looking closely in other evaluations that we are currently conducting. For example, the climate information and early warning system evaluation, also building a lot on the findings from these evaluations related to how traditional knowledge is being harvested from Indigenous peoples and how it's being used now in specific initiatives, especially as you know, early warning system is one of those that really can build a lot on the Indigenous knowledge guidelines and guide and wisdom and learnings that they have been accumulated throughout the years. So there is a lot to talk about, but maybe I would just Rish, if you have any other reflections on this, over to you.
All good, Genta. I think you covered it all. Cheers.
Great. Helen, perhaps anything you feel like you missed out on or you'd like to highlight before we move on to the...
Yeah, thank you, Josephine. Maybe just on the traditional knowledge bit. Yeah, I think we know that the GCF is now developing the locally led climate action portfolio, where I think there's going to be a lot of opportunities for Indigenous peoples maybe to engage and also to inform how locally led climate action could look like, especially in Indigenous peoples context. But one thing that I also would like to maybe caution or raise in this matter is that, yes, it's good to be harnessing traditional knowledge of Indigenous peoples, how they're doing climate action, climate adaptation or mitigation. But maybe one other thing that we should also be looking out is the ownership and also appropriation or misappropriation of traditional knowledge. There's a lot that Indigenous peoples can offer, but also the GCF IP policy is also very clear in terms of not only ensuring that benefits are accessed or that Indigenous peoples benefit from GCF initiatives, but the other one is also ensuring that there's no harm done to Indigenous peoples in all GCF finance activities. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Helen. All right. Okay. I'm sure. Let's move on to the next segment of this session. All right. So thank you to Helen again for that and for Genta's response. I do see a hand being raised already. Before I take you, Minnie, I will like to, welcome or open the floor to questions and reflections. Again, please send them in through the chat, or if you'd like to speak directly, feel free to raise your hand like Minnie, and I'll do my best to bring you in to ask your question. We'll get through as many as time as allows us. So let's dive into the Q&A. Minnie, please go ahead.
Good morning. Thank you. I had to raise my hand because the rains are getting stronger and I might lose connection. I just wanted to, acknowledge this effort to do an evaluation of the GCF 8 years after the policy has been implemented or has been adopted. The findings are a bit surprising and worrying, because I really thought that, with the adoption of the policy, things would improve. But of course, we know that things do happen in on its own pace. Two things. One of the things that always come up when we talk of evaluations is the capacity of the evaluation team. And in this case, I'm not questioning, of course, the capacity of the evaluation unit, but often, even if there's already a window for Indigenous peoples implementation, if the evaluation team is not capacitated enough or does not have the necessary sensitivity to see how Indigenous peoples are actually being impacted and what are their real feelings with regards projects in their territories. I think it's important to recognize that there is also need to make sure that evaluation teams have that expertise, that sensitivity to Indigenous people's situations and cultures. And this goes also to the GCF Secretariat. Is there a dedicated team in GCF that looks after Indigenous people's issues? I think having the IPAG, and I salute the IPAG because you're doing a lot of work, which really the Secretariat should be doing. So is there a dedicated unit in the GCF Secretariat that looks at Indigenous peoples, just to make sure, like what Helen was saying, capacity building of the staff is very much necessary. So if these still do not exist, then perhaps it goes into the recommendations, making sure that within the staff of the GCF, that there's a team that actually is dedicated to ensuring that the principles in the policy are being carried out, as well as in the evaluation unit. So thanks so much.
All right, I would say, Rishabh, would you like to take Penny's question?
Minnie, a very critical question. Thank you for raising this. Firstly, I can answer this in two parts. The answer in the Secretariat and then in the IU. In the Secretariat, when this evaluation was being undertaken, we had a dedicated division called the Office of of OSI, which had IP's experts present. And when we were forming the approach paper, we did consult them to ensure that we're getting the technicalities correct. But also I want to state that we got real-time inputs from the IPAG. We had many meetings with them during the formulation of the TOR. During the approach paper, we shared the factual draft, and Helen and other IPAG members' interventions and guidance was instrumental to this evaluation. But I also want to state that, at the IU, we're an independent unit with a mandate to undertake many evaluations which require varied of technical expertise. We also rely on external experts who we hire as consultants. So we actually were working with the IIED and SOFA UK, who had expertise in Indigenous peoples, working with the IPs in varied contexts from Asia to Africa to Latin America. And many of our country experts, when we visited the field to Botswana, to Colombia, to Paraguay, were IPs themselves. I personally visited Colombia and I was in the La Mojana region. And when we went there, we met the Zenu people, and we ensured that we were informed by the Indigenous Evaluation Framework. But many, I have to state, because this evaluation was done within a 9-month period, there were limitations. So we were informed by the Indigenous Evaluation Frameworks, but not being able to implement them completely. But rest assured, we ensured to not only have the IP stakeholders consulted during the writing of the report and testing the findings, but also including and trying to get the perspectives from the ground, from the depths of Botswana to the depths of Colombia, to the depths of Philippines, to Vanuatu, to integrate into this report. And Minnie, I would love to share the 5 country case study reports that we've written and love to get your feedback on that. Cheers.
Maybe
Thank
if
you
I
very
can
much.
come in quickly,
Yes,
Rishabh
Genta, go
covered
ahead.
most of the issues, but thank you, Minnie, for your question. We did actually see a change after the adoption of the policy. I think your comment is correct. So the policy is supposed to safeguard and to improve the co-benefits, the benefits to IPs. And we did see a difference between the period before the policy was not in place and after. So especially in the quality of the funding proposals, we did evidence that change. And again, the results related to safeguarding seems to have been stronger after the adoption of the policy. But now the organization, the GCF, needs to move on to the next level, where the sharing of benefits, empowerment of IPs, participation is much more meaningful and stronger. In terms of the capacities of the evaluation team, as Rishabh mentioned, we did engage locally with a number of IPs experts, and also IPs members of IPs groups. And also we did in our methodology, the ethical considerations were very strictly adhered to. And finally, on the structure within the GCF, so currently, as you probably know, GCF is undergoing a restructuring. So there is, of course, attention towards the IPs, and of course, also this evaluation contributed to enhance this attention towards the IPs. And at the policy level, for example, there are, I think, two dedicated staff that are working into further integrating the IPs policy into different programs and strategies, approaches that GCF undertakes. And then in the implementation origination level, there is also specific dedicated staff that works into looking into how IPs considerations are considered and providing dedicated advice. But yes, within the evaluation, we do also look into the current structure, and of course some further insights you can find into the evaluation on how GCF can further improve the capacities also internally to further advance the IP's agenda.
All right. Thank you, Genta, for that. Yes, Helen.
Yeah,
Please go ahead.
maybe just to add a little bit to what Rishabh and Genta have mentioned. Thank you, Minnie, for the question, and I second Genta's point on seeing some improvements after the GCF policy has been adopted by the GCF. But what we are trying to say is that it is not enough. The GCF has to, step up and really operationalize the IP policy. Having a very robust, very strong IP policy is good, but really having framework, how to monitor, how to implement, how to monitor, how to track, and also assess how the IP policy is being operationalized at the country level, at the project level is equally, if not more important. So the IP policy provides that there should be a senior Indigenous Peoples officer. Right now, we have 2 Indigenous Peoples focal point in the GCF, but not at the senior management level. So maybe if we're looking for something that can be done in terms of moving this forward, having a senior management officer, an Indigenous people senior management officer, would be one recommendation. The other one for me is that because the IEU evaluation did review of the portfolio of the GCF, and which the IPAG has also done with the Office of the Sustainability and Inclusion team. And interestingly, there's a slight difference, I think, maybe because of some, metrics that we have used. So the IEU evaluation came up with like 128 projects that are implemented in Indigenous peoples areas, whereas the IPAG exercise came out with 110. So again, this shows that while the numbers are close, because we don't have one single, framework how to look at the portfolio and how we should be looking how Indigenous peoples are going to be affected in GCF projects. That's why the difference in number. And maybe also just to share that since the establishment of the IPAG in 2022, there's resource that's being provided by the GCF. But what we are also recommending is for a continuous resourcing of the work on Indigenous peoples in the GCF, and not only of the IPAG. I mean, the IPAG is only there to provide advice, but it should not be a substitute of the GCF really working directly with Indigenous peoples, organizations, communities, and Indigenous peoples on the ground. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Helen, for your response. I see a question in the chat from Giovanna Mariosa. She says, thank you all for the valuable contributions shared so far. I would like to ask how you envision strengthening the autonomy of Indigenous organizations in accessing resources directly from the GCF. Very good question there. Perhaps Genta or Rishabh, whoever goes first. Please come.
Yeah.
Yes, go Rishabh.
I can hop in. Okay, Giovanna, this is a very valid question, and we have been touching upon the capacities of IPOs, especially, and how they can access GCF. However, Giovanna, limited to this evaluation, we can't answer this question directly. I guess it's better place for Helena to speak a bit more about how she might foresee it. But I promise you, we can evaluate this when the time comes. So, Helen, over to you. What do you think about this?
Thank you, Rishabh, and thank you, Giovanna. Yes, I mean, we always come from the perspective that Indigenous peoples are not just mere victims of climate change. We are agents of, the solution. And we want to start there by recognizing this contribution of Indigenous peoples in climate solution. And so for me, strengthening the autonomy of Indigenous peoples organizations in accessing resources directly from the GCF is really putting them in the leadership position in terms of determining what kind of a window or a dedicated mechanism in the GCF for Indigenous peoples work for them best. Determining what kind of equitable benefit sharing would look like in the community level. Designing the dedicated window, implementing it themselves. One of the key outcome of the evaluation is that there's not one single Indigenous peoples organization that is accredited in the GCF, meaning there's no Indigenous peoples organization accessing money from the GCF to channeling it to Indigenous peoples themselves. So if this is not happening, then there must be something challenging, or there must be something wrong with the system or the architecture. Why is this not happening? When on the one hand, we are saying that Indigenous peoples are, contributing a lot to climate action. So empowering or giving autonomy to Indigenous peoples to really shape that specific window, intentional for Indigenous peoples, a dedicated arrangement is something that we want to see in the GCF, Indigenous peoples leading the way and really developing this window that works best for them.
Thank you, Helen. And
Maybe one
Rishabh, your
final
response?
sentence
Of
on
course.
on the IPOs. I think what we found that indeed there are no accredited entities, IPOs within GCF, but they have been only a few of them have been included as implementing entities, as we call them. And in those cases, so I think the evaluation really makes a strong point on this, that when the IPOs were part of the project as implementing entities or consulted, the results were extremely or overwhelmingly positive. And of course, one of the recommendations also builds on this finding and recommends the GCF to look into including IPOs and civil society, especially in supporting the IPO-related operations within the GCF projects. And of course, also within the conduction of the FPIC process, we found that the role of IPOs needs to further be enhanced and has a lot of potential.
Great. Thank you, Genta. Do we have any more questions from anybody else? Raise your hand, put it in the chat. All right. I have a question of my own. This one is to Rishabh. I mean, earlier during your presentation, you had talked about the IP's policy, that, it was being put into operation in diverse contexts, quote unquote, where the level of the recognition of the IPs may vary significantly. Could you expand a little more on this? What does that mean?
Thanks, Josephine. It's one of our findings, maybe the 20th. I want to start with saying that on the spectrum, not all IPs are the same. Just like not all contexts are the same, just like how not all GCF projects are the same, yet the IP's policy has to apply to everyone. If you look at the spectrum, you have the case of Ecuador, where there's political inclusion of IPs in the government, to Colombia, where IPs are involved in the country platforms. But when you move to Africa, some countries would say that all citizens are IPs. Yet this policy applies to everybody. So the policy and its operational guidelines acknowledges that self-identification as indigenous and other aspects such as collective attachment to territories, distinct languages, and unique cultural practices can be the basis for the policy's application. So this allows the policy to be inherently adaptable even in contexts with a diversity of formal recognition of IPs around the world. And this flexibility, Josephine, is crucial in contexts where IPs are not formally recognized, because the policy can still be applied effectively by focusing on communities that self-identify themselves as distinct. In addition, the policy also allows the use of alternative terms where the consideration of indigenous status may be politically or legally sensitive. So we have evidence that GCF finance is still reaching beneficiaries where IPs may not be recognized, without undermining the country ownership context viewed from the NDA and from the country's viewpoint, or contravening any national laws.
Wow,
and that's why I think this makes the IP's policy as a gold standard. But as we've highlighted in the report, and also how Helen has reiterated, that we have to implement the policy. So yes, Helen, we're finding some good evidence and some counterfactuals, hoping with fingers crossed that there's more optimized implementation of the IP's policy.
Wow, that's quite insightful. Thank you, Rishabh. Yes, if more questions, anyone? Going once, going twice. Yes, Minnie, please come back.
Sorry, because I'm only just looking at the evaluation report. I just wonder, in those projects that Indigenous peoples are either beneficiaries or partners, is there a deep dive on the role of the accredited entities or how do you, I'm used to the GCF language, implementing agencies, accredited entities, and how much of the administrative burden is being passed from them to the community organizations, or, basically my question is the role of the accredited entities in terms of not just getting the consent, the free prior informed consent, but in the full cycle of the project, from the report making, evaluation, and how is this balance vis-a-vis the role of the implementing partners or the communities themselves? So, thanks.
Genta? Yes.
Yes, I can answer quickly on this, and other colleagues may come in. So thank you, Nini, for the question. So the role, the AE's capacities, capabilities, and internal policies related to Indigenous peoples are being vetted at the accreditation level, but not specifically for Indigenous peoples, though. So some of these capacities are being assessed when the funding proposal is submitted to GCF. And the accredited entity has to submit an ESS plan, environmental, social, safeguard, social and safeguard plan, and also an IPP's plan, as we call Indigenous Peoples Plan, where they have to explain how the project is impacting IPs or how IPs are participating. And then the GCF has to review this and provide recommendations, approve it, move forward, and so forth. So there is some work that is done with the accredited entities at the entry level, but within the second due diligence role of GCF, that's what we are actually proposing for much more clarity on what GCF actually needs to request these accredited entities, because we found a lot of duplications. We also found areas where accredited entities did not cover specifically. For example, FPIC process was followed quite well by UN agencies, which do have the capacities in place to conduct such process, but especially for private sector entities, we did find areas for.
Right. Thank you, Genta, for your response. Rishabh?
Thank you. And I want to bring the element of the different capacities of GCF partners that work with us. Many, as you may be aware, that our accreditation model, we can accredit a local direct access entity, but also have an international entity. We have found that most of the portfolio out of the 128 projects that we identified are indeed implemented by the internationally accredited entities. And we found, for example, entities like FAO and IPAG and even UNDP are seen as quite capacitated on this. But generally speaking, the MDBs are not. So in general, it is fair to say that we find entities' social capital, their history of working in the region and knowing the context, and the relation with the communities are critical factor in the quality of FPIC and other dimensions. So for example, in the La Mojana project, which is in Colombia, while it is being implemented, while it has been approved to UNDP and managed from the Panama office, they have indeed gotten an IPO as an executing entity, which had a role to play in undertaking the FPIC. So yes, Minnie, to answer your question, the GCF is accessible to varied of institutions with varied capacities. Those institutions can have varying capacities around the world, and that can have a direct impact on how they program with us. That's why we also have the biggest readiness funding, which can be tapped by both the countries and the entities to build the capacities.
Wonderful, Rishabh. I do see another question. I know we are a little over time by 2 minutes, but that's quite all right. I see a question from Hugh Sharma. I hope I said your name right. I beg your pardon if I didn't. He says, I'm wondering if there are implications of the study for evaluation design and ways of knowing. Apologies if this point already had been addressed by speakers, but I arrived late. That's quite all right, Hugh. Evaluation design. Genta?
maybe I can come quickly on this one. Yes, we did try to, as much as possible in the evaluation design, to integrate Indigenous evaluation methods. As we kind of touched also during the first part of the presentation, that considering the timeline of the evaluation, it was quite difficult to fully apply these methods. But we did try to integrate, to the extent possible, Indigenous peoples in local context. So we did integrate and we did engage with Indigenous peoples in almost all the country case studies, and they were kind of the entry point for us to communicate with Indigenous peoples. All the interviews were conducted in the local language. We also did respect traditions and ways of communicating, gathering in the communities that we visited. So we did, to answer your question, Hugh, we did apply to the extent possible some of these Indigenous evaluation approaches, and that's kind of the, and in the evaluation as well, in the evaluation document itself, we do explain in the methodology part how this was undertaken.
I think I want to build up on the great thing that
Okay.
Genta started and use an excerpt. Here we visited Botswana and we went to the peripheries of the Kalahari Desert where we met the San people. Over there, they have a kotla system where when you go to the village, you have to go to their local system of governance where you have a chair. And we were asked to go on the stage and recite a prayer first before the kotla system could then ask the beneficiaries who are part of the project to give us feedback. So these are part of the evaluation standards that the IU also follows of accountability, integrity, but also with ensuring that we respect human rights, local traditions, gender norms. So we entered the field for meeting the IPs, training ourselves about evaluation ethics and sensitivities to ensure that our presence is not leading to any maladaptation or any unintended consequences. So yes, we had to really focus on that bit as well. But Hugh, we mentioned this in the beginning, that truly it's impossible to truly understand the nuances of different IPs communities around the world by just visiting them for 5 days. And that was the limitation of this evaluation. I would love to be with them and stay with the communities for weeks or months in time to get the true stories out, but that's the limitation of this evaluation that I have to go back to the headquarters. So this will always be a misgiving of this evaluation, and hopefully we are able to integrate the Indigenous evaluation methodologies and frameworks more actively or with more space, provided we have a long timeline. But yes, Hugh, we tried our best. Cheers.
That's great. That's great. I think I'm going to close today's session. We're 6 minutes in over time, but it's just been amazing. So as we close today's session, I just want to extend a sincere thank you to all of you for joining us and for contributing to such a meaningful and reflective dialogue. A special thanks to our presenters, Rishabh and Genta, for walking us through the IP's evaluation findings and conclusions, and also through the Q&A session. And again, thank you to Helen for bringing depth and clarity and a grounded perspective to this conversation as well. Today's discussion has definitely reminded us that Indigenous peoples are not only stakeholders, in the climate finance, but they are right holders. I've heard this, they're knowledge holders and vital leaders, in the global response to climate change. So moving from safeguards to agency is not just a technical shift, but more, a moral one and a strategic one. I also want to express a deep appreciation to Therese Gonzaga, who's behind the scenes from the IU, for her tireless efforts, in organizing today's session, and for the great collaboration with the GLocal team as well in making this dialogue possible. Everyone, we do look forward to seeing you in the next GLocal session. Please take care and goodbye for now.